सबसे पहले आपको बताएं कि भारत के नाकारा मिसाइल सिस्टम का भांडा फूट गया।
In the springtime of 2022, something very unprecedented happened, or at least something that had not happened in a long time, which was a nuclear-armed country accidentally launching a missile into another nuclear-armed country's territory.
This is Matt Korda. He's a senior researcher for the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists.
By all accounts, India was in the midst of some kind of demonstration or exercise, and a missile accidentally got launched somehow.
That missile he's talking about, it started its journey in northwestern India near a major Indian Air Force base.
So it then traveled in a southwesterly direction for about 100 kilometers.
It was passing over Indian territory at this point, whizzing by unsuspecting commercial air traffic, hurtling over farmland and small towns, and making its way toward the vast Rajasthani desert.
And then it suddenly turned northwest and crossed into the India-Pakistan border.
For several minutes, it flew deeper and deeper into Pakistani territory. It wasn't armed with a nuclear warhead, but Pakistan didn't know that. Pakistan scrambled its jets, and India said nothing.
And then it crashed near the Pakistani town of Mian Shanu, and very luckily, it didn't crash into any buildings or any people.
Thankfully, no one was hurt, and Pakistan didn't retaliate.
Pakistan strongly protests this flagrant violation.
But they were pretty mad.
And cautions against recurrence of any such incident in future.
So they demanded answers for 2 full days until India finally made a statement.
The first thing that India said about this was that it was a technical error with the missile, which they then very quickly changed that story. And it was attributed to human error, and then several officers were discharged.
Human error and technical malfunction are 2 sides of the same coin when it comes to nuclear security. And especially from the outside, it can be really hard to tell which one is at fault.
According to Indian defense sources, a series of software locks would have had to have been bypassed, and 2 manual keys would have had to be inserted in order to initiate that launch countdown.
The fact that this didn't start a nuclear war, it was just lucky timing.
India and Pakistan were not actively in a conflict at the time, but that certainly wasn't always the case, right? Like in 2019, 2021, there have been instances in which people have died on both sides of that conflict, right? I think we got very lucky that this was during a period of relative peacetime. It's a wild example of what can happen when you have these human error bits that inject themselves into an ongoing kind of simmering nuclear crisis.
We don't know for sure what happened the day that India fired a missile at Pakistan out of the blue, exactly who did what wrong, or if there really was a problem with the missile or software involved in its launch. But the incident raises at least a few big questions. One massive one: how hard would it be for an enemy to mess with these weapon systems on purpose? And could our very own American nuclear weapons be hacked? I'm Lacey Healy, and this is Things That Go Boom.
Artificial intelligence is at a crossroads. How did we get here? Listen to Technically Optimistic, a new podcast from Emerson Collective, and journey into the rapidly evolving world of AI with host Rafi Krikorian, Chief Technology Officer. Told through the intimate stories of experts at the forefront of transformation, each episode gives us deeper understanding of the trade-offs and opportunities posed by the AI revolution. The future is unknown, but we are technically optimistic. Listen on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts.
The short answer is yes. Nuclear weapons, nuclear command, control, and communications, they all use computers, and so they are all indeed vulnerable to cyber attacks. But to understand how that might work, we need to take a little tour through history.
My name is Allison Pitlack, and I am the program lead of the cyber program at the Stimson Center.
Allison has been working on cybersecurity and accountability issues for about a decade. So we asked her when it was that hacking really started to feel like a threat to nuclear security. And she told us about this day back in 2010, when a bunch of nuclear weapons in Wyoming suddenly disappeared.
Basically, yeah, there was a hardware glitch that took about 50 of the US's ICBMs offline for about 45 minutes.
Officials at the time said that the error was the result of a hardware malfunction, that the communication signals between the missiles and the control center had just gone haywire. They also made it clear that they had no reason to suspect that anyone had done this on purpose. It was not a cyber attack. As a result, President Obama was briefed, the problem was resolved in less than an hour, and life went on. But for folks on the outside, this glitch felt like a warning.
This was a wake-up call in the community that the online components, the online abilities, need to be protected and they need to be safe, even if the cause wasn't coming as a result of a hack or an intrusion.
Just to be clear, even when these 50 nukes went unexpectedly offline, the U.S. still had about 400 land-based nuclear missiles working just fine, so that's a whole lot. And officials said that they could have even launched the glitchy 50 during this tech kerfuffle using backup systems, if they had to. On the other hand, there is some evidence that this same computer error may have taken missiles offline a couple of times before 2010. And when my laptop crashes at a bad time and then does it again, I start to think about getting an upgrade. Which brings us to a hot topic in the world of nuclear security and disarmament: modernization.
So modernization is about a whole wide range of updating things, going from the old days of analog, air-gapped, floppy disk systems into a new world where everything is digitalized, where systems are online. This just introduces a whole new range of risks and vulnerabilities.
50, 60 years ago, there was no real prospect of any kind of external control being exerted over a country's nuclear arsenal because they would be effectively like hacking a typewriter, right? Like it just wouldn't be possible.
But you might be thinking, hey, that's a good thing. Modern computers are way more capable and less likely to glitch out than those old floppy disk systems. And you'd be right. But the other thing about modernizing systems is that it makes them more complicated.
There's a very prominent academician named Dan Geer who said something along the lines of, "We've created systems more complex than we can manage."
This is Paige Stoutland. He's currently a consultant at the Nuclear Threat Initiative.
And he was referring to business systems and finance systems and so on. But it's true here, too.
Paige told us that it's pretty hard as civilians to know for sure what the exact vulnerabilities in each system are, because so much about nuclear weapons is classified.
But I think we have to assume that every digital system is vulnerable to a certain extent.
At this point, to get us in the mindset of someone who might attack a digital system, we decided to call up a hacker.
The first bug I ever found was a bug in the Android operating system, the kernel.
But she doesn't actually sound like that.
I'm Maddie Stone, and I am a security researcher at Google, where I hunt down and analyze zero-day exploits that attackers are using in the wild against folks.
How does your actual work compare to what people think that hackers are in movies? Are you ever wearing a hoodie and typing really, really fast?
I have heard that I do type somewhat fast, but
that's fair. You work at a computer.
I'm much more of a crew neck sweatshirt if I'm in a sweatshirt type of person. Don't usually sit in dark rooms, and my keyboards are pink with rainbow lights on them. So I don't know that I necessarily fit sort of those hacker stereotypes of what people think of as hacker culture versus hacker the job.
Maddie doesn't defend weapons systems or work for the government, but she does shut down attacks that make us all vulnerable.
When I joined a team at Google focused on bug hunting, the first bug I ever found was in use by a commercial surveillance vendor called NSO Group. So they were using this bug to allegedly install their Pegasus spyware onto Android devices.
It's a military weapon used against civilians. This is extremely serious for democracies.
The malware Pegasus, made by the Israeli cyber surveillance company NSO Group,
has been used by client states to target the phones of journalists, activists, human rights groups, even politicians.
Since NSO was going after Android, Google put Maddie on the case. She had a document that NSO was using to convince potential customers that they could really hack Androids. And Maddie's mission was to use those clues to track down the one exact piece of code that was allowing the spyware to get in.
I had been taking my teammates with me through the highs and lows of thinking I'd found this bug. So they've been with me when I was like, oh, that's not it. Oh, this is it. Oh, no, this isn't it.
But eventually, it clicked.
It just so happened that we had sort of the perfect lineup of details that there was only one bug that it could be. And so I'd found the vulnerability and I triggered it. And I had to turn to my teammates and be like, how do I file a bug in the issue tracker? Because it was my very first one on this new team.
When you turned to them, did they cheer?
So I don't know that any of them cheered, but they definitely told me nice job and then walked me through exactly how to file a bug in our issue tracker.
It's probably safe to assume that battles like this one are happening in our nuclear weapons systems all the time. And the government employs plenty of security researchers like Maddie who fight them off. But when it comes to nuclear weapons, there are a lot of different systems we have to keep shipshape.
We're talking about the nuclear weapons, we're talking about command and control, we're talking about warning systems.
And as if that weren't stressful enough, it turns out that there's a way to hack these systems before they even exist. Because every computer is only as safe as its parts. And the government buys these parts from a lot of different places. But any widget along the line could, in theory, be vulnerable to what is called a supply chain attack, where hackers infect something important upstream and then wait to take advantage of that until the part gets built into the nuclear systems.
One doesn't necessarily know whether our supply chain has in fact been compromised, and under the right set of situations might not work in the way that we intend it to work.
Information technology company SolarWinds was found to be the target of a massive cybersecurity attack in December.
Hackers breached the computer systems at several federal agencies, including one key department tasked with stopping cyber attacks in the first place.
The SolarWinds incident was a major supply chain attack at the end of 2020. Hackers got access to an update from a software company called SolarWinds and seeded it with malicious code, which then went out to customers, including some major government agencies like the National Nuclear Security Administration. The hackers spent months stealing sensitive information before anyone realized what had happened.
The combination of computer code that's not perfect, which is sort of the root cause of bugs, and human nature together is what results in the fact that essentially every system is vulnerable.
In this case, the people who installed the update didn't really do anything wrong. It's not like they were tricked by a phishing email or some shady supplier. But human mistakes do happen.
Even the history in the United States of people in the defense community plugging in things they shouldn't plug in is not a good history. Not that it's easy. I mean, in the United States, certainly enormous efforts are put on securing our military systems, and in particular those that involve nuclear weapons. So that's really good news. But we should not believe that those measures are going to be perfect forever.
Despite all of the hemming and hawing we hear about how technology can fail, the biggest threat to nuclear cybersecurity is basically the same as when Oppenheimer introduced the thing to the world.
I mean, human nature is human nature.
And it's at the heart of probably the most famous cyber attack on a nuclear facility. Here's Allison.
Stuxnet obviously is what put into public awareness this relationship between cyber weapons and nuclear weapons.
13 years ago, the Stuxnet worm infected Iran's nuclear program, setting it back by years. But a hacker didn't infect Iran's centrifuges from the comfort of a cozy office in Tel Aviv. Instead, a person physically walked into the facility and plugged in infected hardware.
In that instance, I think most people would look to that as being a positive thing, slowing down the production, the enrichment of uranium, and therefore slowing down the development of potential nuclear weapons is a positive. But I think it also brought to attention the vulnerability of these facilities.
This kind of hacking isn't really about ones and zeros. It's about security guards and making sure employees don't go rogue. And it's a big deal. There are whole organizations of people who are paid to talk their way into secure buildings just to help companies find their own weak points. These people might sneak in at night, they might pose as a plumber, or they might even impersonate some bigwig who does have access. Anything they can do to get into a secured area. You should also know that these people are called physical penetration testers, which is just a heck of a title for your LinkedIn page. Anyway, another way humans can wreck the security of a nuclear weapon system is by falling for bad intel. And our more advanced technology might actually make this problem worse.
The issue of misinformation or disinformation. Increasingly, we're starting to see that, and AI is enabling that. AI can mimic your voice and your picture and so on. Those sorts of things can maybe not directly lead to nuclear use, but can affect the picture, if you will, that senior leaders are seeing and might lead them to make a different decision than they would under normal circumstances. And so that sort of thing is increasingly of concern because of all the artificial intelligence advances.
But that mis and disinformation, it doesn't just have to look like a false Facebook post. It can also look like an incoming attack. It's another way that cyber attacks on nuclear systems can target humans.
One of the best known incidents was a computer failure that led to the Russians thinking that they were under attack.
This is the one where the Soviet Union's early warning systems detect a set of missiles on their way from the U.S., and the officer on duty is this guy named Stanislav Petrov. There's a whole holiday that some groups celebrate for this guy.
I'm not a hero. I was just in the right place at the right time.
Anyway, it's 1983 in the wee hours of the morning, and the alarms start blaring. And it's Petrov's job to tell someone immediately.
One needs to make the decision to either retaliate or to ride it out, if you will, within 20 minutes or so.
But instead of alerting his superiors that 5 missiles are headed over the North Pole from the U.S. and potentially setting off a nuclear war, Petrov waits.
And they thought there was something a little unusual about how many weapons were coming over the poles and so on, that they did nothing.
Petrov later told reporters that it didn't make sense that the U.S. would start a nuclear war with only 5 missiles. Plus, Russia's ground radar didn't show any incoming attack. So he followed his gut and called it a false alarm.
They could have retaliated, and the result would be inadvertently starting a nuclear war.
Turned out a satellite had picked up the sun's reflections off the clouds and read that light as incoming missiles. The computers and sensors responsible for early warnings are much more reliable today. But it's not hard to imagine an error or a cyber attack causing another false alarm. And Page says that just the knowledge that any part of our nuclear weapon systems might be unreliable creates a problem in itself.
There's a body of literature that suggests that if you're worried that there's something wrong with your weapons or the adversary is going to take some action, that you ought to aggressively make the first strike, if you will. And so it's conceivable it increases the risk in some way. Exactly how it does that would depend on the individual leader. If nothing else, it increases the uncertainty a lot, and that's usually not a good thing.
And putting the future of humanity on the shoulders of one leader, it feels risky to say the least.
Recognize this is not just about U.S. leaders. We can harden our systems. We can think that we're immune to that sort of thing. Think about what Kim Jong-un is seeing, or some other leader that may in some way have his finger closer to the button, so to speak. We've got to worry about that too, but what we do about that is much, much harder in the international sphere than it is maybe in terms of keeping our own systems secure.
So that's kind of where we're at. We live in a tangle of human and technical vulnerabilities of which any one could lead to nuclear catastrophe. But before you go kiss your loved ones and tell them goodbye, let's all take a deep breath. There are some options to make the survival of our species a little more likely. I mean, you can still go kiss your loved ones, just come right on back after the break. If we want to get rid of the risk that our nukes could be hacked, there are basically 2 directions we could go.
If you are coming from a disarmament perspective or a nuclear abolition perspective, modernization and the new cyber and digital related risks that come with it are really just another reason to disarm and to get rid of nuclear weapons.
That's Allison from the Stimson Center again.
They were already problematic, already risky, already scary. I think what we're seeing now in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war has brought that home to a lot of people. A different perspective would say, Yes, that is important. And yes, we should strive for that. However, that is unlikely in the current geopolitical context. States are, if anything, investing more money in their nuclear weapon arsenals and the modernization processes. And what we need to do is just make sure that they're as safe as possible from a cyber operation or a cyber attack.
It's a debate that has taken on even more relevance since Russia invaded Ukraine.
Nuclear risk is too high, unacceptably high, and in fact highest since the depths of the Cold War. Now, today's risk is much more complicated precisely because of these new and emerging technologies.
This is Izumi Nakamitsu, the Undersecretary General for the United Nations Office of Disarmament Affairs. She has a clear position on the importance of disarmament in the current geopolitical landscape.
Our message has always been very clear. If we want to eliminate the risks coming from nuclear weapons, then the best way is to actually pursue the elimination of the weapons themselves. At the moment, because of the security environment, the move towards the elimination of nuclear weapons is a little bit stalled. But when it comes to nuclear weapons, with all these new types of risks, I think we have to make sure that we go back to the disarmament efforts.
Izumi says that the technologies and specific vulnerabilities may be new, but that the diplomatic strategies for reducing risk are really the same as they've ever been.
I mean, the good example that I often try to use is how the testing of nuclear weapons have been prohibited. And actually, the initial test ban treaty, it's a quite interesting story that was signed and agreed upon in 1963, less than a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
And that was during the height of the Cold War. 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest event where human beings actually came so close to actual nuclear war. Now, the Cuban Missile Crisis actually made both President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev realize that the risk is just so enormous and that arms race is not going to help their respective national security. So they agreed to negotiate, they engaged with each other, and within a year, less than a year, they agreed to actually sign this partial nuclear test ban treaty.
This treaty can be the opening wedge in that campaign. It opens the door for further agreements on the control of nuclear weapons. And it is open for all nations to sign.
It is a very good example of when we can actually identify the risk as a mutual risk to their national securities. They would use arms control and disarmament negotiations as a means for enhancing security. And I think that's a very important lesson that we always need to remember in this intersection of technology and nuclear weapons as well. So I hope that in the current very risky environment, states will come to that realization. We don't have to wait until big, devastating incidents, but let's try to work together to prevent such a catastrophic events.
In addition to good old-fashioned international diplomacy, Paige says that we can make our systems safer by taking a hard look at what would actually happen if something went wrong, for whatever reason.
We at the Nuclear Threat Initiative have been advocates of something called a fail-safe review. And that includes looking at basically what would be the implications if there were to be a system that failed, whether it be a cyber system or another system. So if a particular system gets infiltrated, what is the physical result, if you will? What does that lead to? And so using a term maybe more familiar to the civilian side is it increases our resilience to these things. So you can have a computer failure, but it doesn't lead to inadvertent use of a nuclear weapon.
The Biden administration announced in 2022 that the Department of Defense would do this nuclear fail-safe review, and Congress required it under that year's National Defense Authorization Act. But to really lower the risk of nuclear usage, it can't just be America investigating vulnerabilities.
We encourage all states, all countries, to do fail-safe reviews as well. It's in their interest. They may not have to share the results with anyone, but I think would give us a certain level of comfort that they have done the same type of review as we're doing to make sure that there isn't some accident or blunder that could lead to use of a nuclear weapon.
Undersecretary General Nakamitsu says that some of these reviews and conversations are, in fact, happening among nuclear weapon states.
The Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons have also held important conversations about the need for risk reduction measures that will help prevent any use of nuclear weapons, intentional, accidental, or through miscalculation, misunderstanding.
Those big conversations happen on a 5-year cycle. We're actually just at the start of the next one. And even though relations between the major nuclear weapon states are tense right now, to say the least, Izumi says that this cycle will help open a window for global diplomacy.
It is an important opportunity, we believe, to develop commitments by all states not to hack or spoof or otherwise interfere with nuclear weapon systems. So there are different mechanisms and agreements that can be quite relevant in such a scenario, but the best will be not to see such an eventuality.
Especially because at the moment, most nuclear countries are making it faster and easier to launch their nukes.
We're also seeing statements come out of countries like India. Let's say we used to have our weapons in a state of readiness that would take hours to launch. Now it's in seconds or minutes, right? So we're starting to see this kind of creep into the doctrine or the public statements as well.
When India prepares to launch faster, then so does Pakistan. North Korea has similarly been open about their plans to launch really, really early if they suspect foul play. On the other side of the spectrum is the UK.
They have said very publicly that a response would come perhaps in hours or days rather than in seconds or minutes.
Launching in seconds means that there's less time to think or to double-check the computers. But for most of the nuclear world, the fingers are still getting closer to the buttons, even if there is something holding those fingers back.
One thing that I do believe in is the strength of the nuclear taboo, right? I generally do think that countries view nuclear weapons as very distinct weapons that would cross a line if they were used. And I think that leaders probably recognize that for the most part, there isn't a huge downside to preparing for nuclear war, at least from their perspectives, right? But nobody benefits from actual nuclear war, and especially those leaders that start a nuclear war. And so when I see this nuclear belligerency, it doesn't feel good, and it certainly makes me a little nervous, but I don't think that it necessarily translates into Putin reaching for a nuclear weapon to use in this conflict, because I want to think anyways that he knows that there's a very substantial difference between nuclear signaling and actually using a nuclear weapon.
Maddie also had some good news, which is that even as nuclear states are becoming more secretive about their weapons and plans, in the cybersecurity world, transparency is kind of on the rise.
I think things are 100% getting better. It used to be that vendors wouldn't admit that something was exploited. Like, how can I admit that? But now we're seeing it's becoming the default. And that's huge. And there's more and more collaboration occurring in terms of detecting these exploits. And so that gives me hope and excitement.
And she said there are actually some upsides to working with increasingly complex systems.
Years ago, you could maintain a capability. So let's say an attacker's capability is they want to remotely install spyware on a phone. That maybe took 2 exploits to be able to accomplish. Nowadays, for most phones, you need to be chaining 3 or 4 of these exploits together in order to have that capability. So that's great because we're doubling the number of exploits they have to find, maintain, and build to be able to have a capability of remotely installing spyware.
I don't know about you, but when I think about nuclear and I think about cyber, a lot of times I kind of just want to pack it in. Like, what can we possibly do? But the experts, they still have some hope.
Nukes are one of those things that people tend to default to a sort of fatalism about. And so the cyber element is really interesting because I think what it demonstrates is that the existing systems that we have built are a lot less stable than people think that they are, because cyber threats don't create necessarily completely new vulnerabilities, but they exacerbate these existing sort of fractures in the system.
Matt says that at least those fractures, they bring our eyes back to some of the dangers of nukes that we've managed to live with for so long, and they get people talking about what to do with them. Maybe that's enough to give the rest of us a little hope, too. Things That Go Boom is distributed by Inkstick Media and PRX. If you're listening and you like what we do, we would love a review as always. It's just as easy as tapping that star in your listening app. You can head on over there right now if you want to. And remember to send us your questions about the internet and security to boom@inkstickmedia.com so that we can answer them in a special Q&A episode later this season. This episode was produced by Nikki Galtland and me, and edited by Christina Stella, Katie Toth, and Sahar Khan. Our music for the show is written by Darian Schulman, and Robin Wise makes each episode sound its very best. Thanks, as always, to the supporters and foundations that make our work possible: the Carnegie Corporation of New York and Plowshares Fund, as well as Inkstick supporters, including the Colomb Foundation, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, Prospect Hill Foundation, and the Jubitz Family Foundation. In 2 weeks, we're digging into the world of AI art and what it can tell us about how we work with some of the most vulnerable victims of war.
I went home after this long day of figuring out how to report it, and I sat on my couch and I ordered a salad, fries, and ice cream because, you gotta have balance in your life somewhere.